Every sentence felt like a discovery the world ignored. The battle for Moscow in the autumn and winter of 1941 was one of the most dramatic turning points of World War II. A moment when the world held its breath, unsure whether the Soviet Union would survive the German onslaught. The story of this battle is not only a military chronicle, but also a tale of unimaginable endurance, desperation, and the human will to resist against overwhelming odds. In early October 1941, with Operation Barbarossa advancing rapidly, Adolf Hitler believed that victory was within reach. His armies had already seized vast territories, captured hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers, and destroyed countless tanks and aircraft. Moscow, the heart of the Soviet Union, seemed exposed. Taking the Soviet capital would deliver a fatal blow to Stalin's regime, disrupt communications, destroy administrative leadership, and cripple the morale of the Soviet people. Hitler imagined German soldiers marching through Red Square before winter fully set in. The German High Command launched its grand offensive toward Moscow under the name Operation Typhoon. It was intended to be the final storm that would sweep away the Soviet state. 3 massive pincers, an armored spearhead from the north, another from the south, and infantry forces in the center drove forward with terrifying speed. The German generals were confident. They had crushed France the year before. Why should Moscow be any different? Yet, the road to the Soviet capital was unlike anything the Germans had faced before. As the first days of October unfolded, the weather suddenly changed. Heavy rains transformed the Russian countryside into a vast sea of mud. Tanks sank axle-deep into the earth. Horses struggled to pull carts. Trucks stalled. The roads, already primitive, dissolved into sticky rivers of brown sludge. German soldiers cursed the mud, the infamous Rasputitsa, as it devoured their vehicles and slowed their advance to a crawl. But despite the mud, the Germans continued to push forward. They captured Vyazma and Bryansk, creating massive encirclements that trapped more than 600,000 Soviet soldiers. Many in Berlin believed that the Soviet Union had finally been defeated. Newspapers in Germany declared that Moscow would fall within days. But the Soviets were not broken. Inside Moscow, fear spread like wildfire. Government offices prepared to evacuate. Trains carried civilians eastward. Factories were dismantled and moved to the Urals. The capital braced itself for the worst. Rumors circulated that Stalin himself would leave the city. Yet, in one of his most symbolic decisions, he chose to stay. His presence in Moscow became a powerful symbol for the Soviet population. If the leader was refusing to flee, then Moscow must be defended. And so began one of the greatest defensive efforts of the war. Hundreds of thousands of civilians, women, old men, and even school children worked day and night to build anti-tank ditches, trenches, barricades, and wooden blockades. They dug with bare hands, shovels, and whatever tools they could find. The city transformed into a fortress. At the same time, fresh Soviet divisions from Siberia and the Far East began arriving. Equipped with winter gear and experienced in fighting in brutal cold, these troops would soon prove decisive. By late November, the German army finally reached the outskirts of Moscow. Patrols could reportedly see the distant glow of the city. Some German officers even claimed they could read road signs showing the distance to the Kremlin. But then, winter fell. Not an ordinary winter, but one of the coldest in decades. Temperatures dropped to minus 30 degrees Celsius, sometimes minus 40 degrees Celsius. Oil froze inside engines. Machine guns jammed. German soldiers wrapped themselves in blankets, carpets, newspapers, anything to keep warm. Frostbite spread through the ranks. Horses died in the snow. Food supplies dwindled. The Wehrmacht had been prepared for a quick victory, not a drawn-out winter war. In contrast, the Soviet troops were far better equipped. Their tanks used oil that resisted freezing. Their boots, coats, and mittens were designed for Siberian temperatures, and they knew how to fight in the cold. As December arrived, the German advance stalled completely. Their soldiers could go no farther. They were freezing, starving, exhausted, and still hundreds of kilometers from home. For the first time, German commanders admitted the truth: they could not take Moscow. Then came the counterattack. On December 5th, 1941, Soviet forces launched a massive offensive along the entire Moscow front. Fresh Siberian divisions struck with overwhelming force. Germans were stunned by the suddenness of the assault. Troops who had expected victory were now pushed backward through snowdrifts. Entire German units collapsed. Villages, forests, and frozen fields became battlegrounds soaked in blood. The Germans, for the first time in the war, were forced into a large-scale retreat. The myth of the invincible blitzkrieg was shattered. As Soviet forces pushed westward, the mood in Moscow changed. People who had prepared for death now felt hope. Radio broadcasts announced the liberation of towns and villages near the capital. Factories resumed full production. The Soviet flag continued to fly over the Kremlin. Despite unimaginable hardship, the Soviet Union had survived the greatest threat in its history. The battle for Moscow did not end with the winter of 1941, but its opening chapters defined the turning point. The failure of Operation Typhoon marked the end of Germany's dream of a quick victory. The Nazi regime now faced a long, bitter war of attrition, a war it could not win. The story of the battle for Moscow is one of endurance, the endurance of soldiers who froze in trenches, of civilians who dug fortifications with numb hands, of a city that refused to surrender, and of a nation that rose from the brink of destruction. The world expected Moscow to fall. Instead, it became the graveyard of Hitler's hopes.